Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making. And on this episode we're going to be taking a look at the Eduard FW190A-8. Now, in my P400 video, I had made mention that sometimes I try to avoid doing or showing smaller, inconsequential steps in my build process in order to cut down the runtime of my videos. However, you guys left a lot of comments saying that you actually wouldn't mind perhaps seeing some of the stuff that I tend to leave out. And so I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment with this video and pretty much show you every step of the build from beginning to end, including smaller stuff that I tend to find inconsequential. So let me know what you think. So this video is long. It's an hour and 20 minutes long. Let me know in the comments what you think about this format, this type of build video where I'm really going to be showing you pretty much a little bit of everything in this video. So I would really love to hear your comments. Tell me what you think. All right. So getting into the build itself. Now, I had purchased this kit as a lightning sale on Sprue Brothers. It was really cheap, and I was really attracted by the box art. I loved the image of like the B-17 ball turret trying to shoot at this FW190 as it's blowing by, and it just looked really cool. I don't know much about the FW190. I mean, I really don't know much about German aircraft in general. I've been trying to learn, and I've built a few 109s now. But this was really my first time ever building an FW190. So I really wasn't expecting much out of this kit when I started, but I ended up just absolutely loving the heck out of this build. And it was just, I'm not quite sure what it was particularly about this build that I just found so enjoyable, but pretty much everything from the beginning to the end, it just fell together. The kit is great and fantastic. I had zero issues with the kit. This is the Profi pack, so you get the photo etch and all that. And it just fell together, and I found myself absolutely enjoying this build. And I tried a few things on here that I'm not really used to doing in terms of like my painting process. So we'll get to that later on. Pretty much up to this point, it's pretty straightforward. We're just putting together all the stuff that goes into the cockpit and getting it all prepared for painting. And there's a little bit of photo etch you put into the cockpit before you paint, and then there's some photo etch you put into the cockpit once you're done painting. I figured with this one, I wanted to try and get a lot of it done ahead of, like, a lot of the internal stuff done in advance so that I could prime it all at once. So here I'm just getting the fuselage halves ready because there's a couple of parts that go into the fuselage halves as well as the engine and some stuff going into the wings that I all wanted to get put together and assembled before I started actually throwing down paint here. So here you can see I'm just trying to get some of the wheel well structure put in and built up both on the top side of the wings and the bottom side of the wings. And the detail that you get in this kit is really nice. And I mean, you get a lot of good structure detail in the wheel wells, and the spent shell chutes coming down from the nose mounted machine guns, things like that. It's really interesting, all the different detail you get in here. Here's some of the exhaust going in. So there's exhaust on the side of the fuselage and then on the bottom as well. Here's those chutes that come down from the upper side of the fuselage that spent brass would eject from. Rib detail going into the wheel wells. So it's interesting because there's some of this detail that goes into the top side of the wing and then some that goes into the bottom side of the wing like this. So it's just interesting that you have two different just layers of how the details work out, and it's really nice. So it all goes together exceptionally well. Like I said earlier, like the kit has, at least I experienced, zero fit issues with this kit. Every part fit exactly as advertised, and not only that, but everything, with a few exceptions, which I'll point out a little bit later on, pretty much like snapped into place and was like good, solid, and there was no ambiguity with how parts should fit. You do have to be aware that if you're doing the A8/R2 version, that there are some holes you have to drill in the upper side of the wings so that you can accept some covers that go into the wings. Just be aware of that. Here I am drilling holes so that we can detail the radial. There isn't much you can see of the radial face once everything gets put together, because you have this little fan unit that goes in front of the engine, and that really blocks a lot of the view directly down into the engine itself. But being who I am, I can't pass up detailing a radial engine. They're just too much fun. So I did go and look at reference pictures just to make sure I was doing it right, because my typical way would have been, spark plug on the front, spark plug on the back, but it appears that the BMW engine had 2 spark plugs on the front side of the cylinders, coming in from different sides, at least from a few of the reference pictures that I could find. Maybe that's not like common or typical, but that's just what it looked like from what I saw. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just getting each of these ignition wires bent in. Now, I do have the wires going from the cylinder heads to the, essentially what would be like the crankcase of the engine, and that's not actually accurate. It would be going more to like an ignition ring that would be around it. But again, since you're not going to be able to see a whole lot into the engine, this was just the easier solution to give the effect. So once all the parts are ready, we can go ahead and start priming. Now, I am using the a Vallejo acrylic primer here because I know that I'm not going to be doing any masking on the interior. If I knew I had to do any kind of masking for interior paintwork, I'd be using a different primer. But one of the nice things about the Vallejo primer is that it's really easy to use, and I don't have to get my full face mask on and, full-blown extraction going. I can get this sprayed in pretty quickly with little fuss, and the family doesn't complain too much about the smell. So we're going to go ahead and get everything primed, cockpit, engines, as well as the inside halves of the fuselage, just to make sure there's no chance of seeing gray plastic in there from some random open area. Another thing I want to say going into this is I know I'm probably not getting the correct colors here. And I know that there are very specific color schemes and very specific colors depending on the year that Luftwaffe aircraft were painted. I'm trying to get as close as I can with the paints that I have on hand, so bear with me. So before you go into the comments saying, Brett, that's not the right shade of gray, instead, give me alternatives in either Vallejo or MIG paints. That would be helpful. So I initially started with a base gray or a base color of German gray, and then now I'm coming and doing highlights with a lightened version of the base color. So basically it's just the base color plus some white, just to create some highlights and a little bit of artificial depth and shadow into the cockpit here. And it's interesting because as I build up this cockpit, I'm reminded of a video I watched by Military Aviation History, the YouTube channel, and talking about the layout of the FW190 cockpit. And also, if you've ever seen Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles, he talks about the layout of the FW190 cockpit as well. But it's generally regarded as like one of the most pilot-friendly, ergonomic, World War II fighter cockpits. And I can see why building this up. I feel like it's really well laid out. All the controls appear to be, in easy to reach. It's not like you're reaching down below your seat to try and do something. So I feel like it is pretty nice. And I mean, those people are experts. They know what they're talking about, so I'll take their word for it. But in my humble, non-expert opinion, I agree with them. So right now, just adding details and weathering to the interior parts here. There is this small cushion that goes onto the seat onto the pilot's seat. So I'm just going through a few stages of dry brushing just to kind of create some high contrast on the seat and pick out some of those small details on there. So I originally started out with like a dark earth color. Now I'm just highlighting with some tans. And then I'm going to go over it with a wash because I want to try and give it kind of a leathery look. I don't know if it was actually leather. It may have just been some kind of textile normal cloth, but in my untrained eye, it looks pretty good. Painting up the canvas boot around the base of the control stick here. and doing some other detail painting. So all the detail painting I do is done with Vallejo acrylics. And this is just straight black with a small brush. Nothing terribly complicated here. Going to do a little bit of chipping. So I'm using a Vallejo color called Oily Steel and just applying it in a, dabbing it on in a as random as possible pattern, where in my mind it would make sense to have chipping. I would imagine that as the pilot's getting in and out of the seat, his boots or the belts, the straps, the metal parts on those would bang against the seat and cause a little bit of chipping. So that's kind of where it makes sense to me. I could be totally wrong about this, but I feel like that makes sense. We'll do a little bit of chipping on the interior of the cockpit floor as well. Again, I would imagine where the pilot's seats would be coming, maybe he drops something while he's in the cockpit, or the ground crew drops something and knocks off a little paint. So basically high, raised areas, that kind of thing. Here we can finish assembling the motor. So like I said, there's this little fan unit that goes on the front, and I couldn't tell you exactly the purpose of that, but I assume it has to do with cooling. So here I've mixed up a wash of artist watercolor, water, and a little tiny bit of dish soap. And I've used this as a wash in the past, but I really wanted to try and refine its application. So I'm actually applying it straight over the paint. I haven't added any matte coat or gloss coat, or this is just straight over the paint, because I really wanted to try and minimize the amount of layers I'm doing on my interior work and still be able to achieve the effects that I want. So having the dish soap in with the water and the paint helps to break the surface tension and allow it to flow rather than bead up and create tides. Once it's dry, it doesn't have to be like 100% completely dry, but once it's dry enough, I can come in with a cotton bud that's slightly damp and remove the excess and remove it on areas that I don't want it. So it works out pretty good. I haven't noticed any like staining or permanent damage to the underlying paintwork, so quite happy with it. And it's easier and cheaper than an enamel wash or an oil wash. But here we can get that little seat cushion installed, and eventually later on I do go and add like scratches to the seat, because I figured out hey, this pilot's been sitting on that seat for a long time, it's going to create wear and scratches. So, but unfortunately I did that off camera, so I apologize I didn't film that. So now we can apply the Eduard pre-colored photo etch, and so we got the side consoles, and then we'll do the instrument panel as well. And again, like I really like the way the layout is set up on this aircraft. It just feels like what a modern cockpit would feel like, but obviously it's not. You do have to be somewhat careful applying the photo etch to the instrument panel faces. Fortunately, Eduard, thinking ahead, has provided you with two different types of instrument panels. They give you these ones that are just blank. There's nothing on the surface, specifically so that you can apply the photo etch. And they also provide you a version that has like raised detail, like a traditional part that you could then paint and add decals to. So it is nice that they give you both of those options, so you don't have to try and like scrape off and sand off raised detail. It works out. And again, the photo etch is multi-layered, and so you have to kind of build up that 3D look, so it gives the appearance that like the instruments are set into the instrument panel, and they do have the actual instrument faces do have a slight like glossy sheen to them. So it is kind of nice out of the box. Applying this kind of photo etch, I remember being really intimidated by this type of photo etch the first time I did it, and it's really not difficult. Kind of once you get through that first time, like once you do it for the first time, you realize like, oh, this isn't actually so bad. So if you've always been on the fence about using photo etch like this in a cockpit, for example, I recommend just trying it. And getting one of these Profi packs is a really good way to start, because it's kind of like an all-in-one type thing. So I would recommend it. Just pull the trigger, take the plunge, get out there and try it. Sometimes you'll get like these really small little like knobs and handles and switches, and honestly there have been times when I've just left these off. Like it wasn't even worth it to me to try and get these on. But with this one, because I was just having so much fun with this one, I really wanted to try and like be thorough with all the stuff that was going into this. So here I'm trying to put on these little like tiny T handles. And I'll be honest, I did get frustrated a couple times because this one in particular that I just got on, that was like the 6th attempt to get that one on. It just did not want to go on. So once the glue dries, I'm going to finish painting these with a little bit of red paint just to get both sides of them. They only have like the red coloring on one side, so it just makes sense. So here you can see I've added some scratches to that seat cushion there. I think it just really helps like add some character to it. And now we can add the seat belts. Now I know a lot of people say like, oh, photo etch seat belts just never look realistic, and I totally get it. They do. It's really hard to get them to look like natural and like they're genuinely draping over an object. But I feel like the alternative is either to not have belts at all, or to go down the route of like those paper type seat belts. I don't really know what they're called. That definitely have a much better appearance, but then it's just additional money out of your pocket to add more aftermarket stuff. So I feel like overall it's worth it to at least have the belts in there rather than have nothing. And then if you don't necessarily have the funds to continue adding aftermarket items to your build, then I think they work pretty good. And in the end, I think they're pretty convincing in the fact that, like, yeah, they look like there are seatbelts on there. They may not necessarily drape and fold great and natural, but I still think they look all right. It also helps kind of like busy up the cockpit and just give it the appearance that there's more going on in there. So now we can get so there's actually two parts to the instrument panel. This is like the lower instrument panel, and then there's like an upper one. Again, it's interesting how it's split that way, but the lower one gets installed into the cockpit tub, whereas the upper one gets installed into the fuselage. So here I'm adding the gun sight, and I found it easier just to install it first and then paint it later. It just made more sense to me to do that. Here we get the control stick added in, and now we can test fit the cockpit to the fuselage. There's great like positive, you can see how it like sits on this shelf and really fits in there nice and snug. Like there's zero ambiguity about how that fits in, and it makes the alignment perfect. So it's great that it is done that way. So here we can paint up the gun sight and get that all installed. The gun sight looks really good. I opted not to replace the actual gun sight glass on this one, and because there is a slight like mold seam running down the middle of the glass, but you really don't see a lot of the gun sight once it's installed in the cockpit, so I wasn't gonna worry too much about it. So here we get this bulkhead installed, and this is really just to kind of block off the front of the cockpit tub so that you don't see all the way back into the engine compartment. And now we can get our halves put together and our engine installed right at the front there. So pretty straightforward how this all goes together like that, and gets lined up. Here we can make sure our glue's in there nice and good. And now we can get the upper portion of the instrument panel installed. This was one of the areas where it was kind of a struggle to make sure I got it to fit right. And you do have to get it to fit right because there's a cowling piece that fits on top that the gun sight has to fit through. So you do have to make sure you get it right. Wing tops going on. I pre-primed the interiors of the gun bay or the wheel wells, but I didn't go ahead and paint them yet. I was looking at the instructions, and the instructions said that the wheel wells were painted the underside color of the aircraft. I kind of questioned it, but I didn't necessarily like go out of my way to research it and just follow the instructions. So if that is incorrect, let me know in the comments down below. Here's those covers that get installed from into the drills that we hold early, into the holes that we drilled earlier. And I assume these were covers for wing-mounted guns, would be my assumption. And so those get installed. So now with the fuselage halves together, we can start going through the process of sanding seams. Now, the way that this kit is designed, there's very few seams to sand. There's this one here along the back of the spine, and then there's this one here on the lower part of the fuselage. And that's really about it. I mean, it's very... Oh, and then obviously like the fronts of the wings here, but I mean, that's about it. And because the fit of the parts was so good, I really didn't need any filler. This was really just the plastic going together, getting it sanded down and polished down, and it was pretty much good to go. So props to Eduard for just absolutely nailing the fit here. So my sanding process, I start out with the file. That really knocks any kind of ridge down, any unevenness between the two halves. And then I start hitting with progressively finer sandpaper, finishing with 800 grit and 1000 grit wet sanding to polish up the plastic. And that pretty much takes care of like 95% of all of my sanding needs. If there's a kit that I'm working on that has a particularly stubborn seam, I might get in there with like some 200 grit sandpaper and really like go to town on it. But most of the time, what I just used here is adequate. So now I can restore some panel lines. I'm just using this little micro saw and cutting back into the plastic to get that panel line restored. And again, because of the very like minimal amount of sanding seams on this kit, there wasn't a lot of panel lines that needed to be restored. So that makes the job easier on this one. Sometimes you have a kit that has tons of panel lines that you have to restore, and it can be a pain, especially if you slip and miss your cut and you have to fill it, sand it all over again and start over. So I'm also restoring some lost rivets here. Now I'm using an old airbrush needle chucked into a pin vise to create my rivets. Now you might be saying like, well, Brett, why don't you just use like a riveting tool? And it's like, well, you could. That is definitely a viable option. I just don't have one. And good, like nice riveting tools with lots of wheels of different spaced, rivet punches, they're not cheap. And I just haven't found a good one yet that I'm willing to spend that much money on. So for the small amount of rivets I'm doing on this one, I can just punch them individually, and it works and it gets me what I need to. And I can ensure the spacing is nice and correct and, things like that. So here we can put on some of the panels for the upper part of the fuselage. Interestingly, this aircraft, and I don't know if it was common with this type or if it was just this specific aircraft, the nose-mounted machine guns are fared over. I don't know if they were removed like to save weight because this was an interceptor and it needed to be able to get up to altitude fast to intercept bombers. Not quite sure. If you know, let me know. Here we can get the lower wing put on. Again, fit here was generally excellent. There was a little slight gap at the back side of that wing, and I did fill that in eventually. I just did not film it. But the fit of the rest of the wing to the fuselage was excellent. Zero issues, and once it's all put together, you can't tell. We get a ring going on to the engine cowl, and then finally this ring here. Now it sits off from the other ring a little bit. You see like there's a gap there. That's intentional. As I understand it, that's actually an outlet for either like the oil cooler, where it would actually like outlet around the circumference of the cowl. So there is supposed to be a small gap there. So if you're doing it and you see that gap and you think like, oh no, it's not fitting right, it is, trust me. So here we can get all the control surfaces and flight surfaces installed on, straightforward, no issues here. The way that they do the upper half and the lower half of the tail fins is really nice because it's all along panel lines. So no filling there, no sanding there. Landing gear going together. These are pretty straightforward. Just basically the main gear leg and then the oleo scissor there. Getting installed. No photo etch on the landing gear. Here I'm cleaning up the tires. So I like the tread on these tires because it just goes around the diameter of the tire, the circumference, whatever. So they're easy to clean up and then rescribe. If it was like a diamond tread pattern on a P51, those are so hard to clean, rescribe every one of those little diamond treads. This is easy. So you just sand down the center seam, and then we can cut back in our grooves there for the tire tread. Easy peasy. So here I'm just getting that in. And again, another nice thing with this is you get separate hubs from the tires, so it makes painting much easier. You don't have to do any masking. So you can paint the hubs separate from the actual tire itself. I really like it when kits do that. Sometimes you'll get ones that'll have like one side is separate, but the other side isn't. And it is what it is. So here there's this strut that attaches to the landing gear leg that I assume facilitates raising and lowering the landing gear. So what I decided to do is get it attached to the landing gear leg and then dry fit the landing gear into the wheel well so that I could get the alignment for this strut correct. And it took a little bit of trial and error, and I finally figured out how to get it in there. But once I figured it out, then it made sense. It was easy to get that in there and get that aligned properly and dried so that it would be easy to install it all as one piece later on in the build. Here we can get the tail wheel assembled. So you do get separate wheel and then the two halves of like the support structure there. And I apologize, this shot's out of focus. For whatever reason, my camera decided it needed to focus on the backdrop. Outer gun barrels going in. So those are slide molded. The gun barrels are molded with open. So that's very nice. I did go through and kind of ream them out just a little bit more just to make the opening a little bit more pronounced. Here we're adding the centerline shackle, bomb rack to the aircraft. Normally it would hold a drop tank. I opted not to install the drop tank on this. I just kind of wanted to go for a cleaner look, but it does go on there as advertised. Moving on to the clear parts here, we can install our paint masks. So obviously, Eduard being a Profi pack here, you do get pre-cut paint masks for all the clear parts, and they work just as advertised. So interestingly, I believe this aircraft had additional like armored glass plate installed onto the sides of the rear canopy. So that's what those rectangular shapes are in the background. There's the armor plate that would go onto the sides of the canopy. So masking this portion, there are a number of different parts that you have to install one at a time. So you get this little part that goes around the radio aerial exit point on there, and then you get all around the perimeter of the clear part here. So you just take your time, slowly install those. And then I like to use the liquid mask to fill in the rest as opposed to like covering it with other pieces of tape. Because I find that no matter how good I am at like trying to cover everything, there's always one little spot that ends up leaking paint through. So I find this just to be a little bit more secure and surefire way to make sure that you don't have any issues with your clear parts. So it just gets brushed on, dries hard, and you're good to go. So here's that little like shroud part that goes over the instrument panel. So the gun sight actually fits through it. So that's why you have to make sure the instrument panel is properly aligned. Now we can get the front windscreen installed, and you can see here that I've actually pre-painted the interior color onto the windscreen there, and excuse me, so that color shows through from the inside. So moving on to painting, we're going to first start by giving everything a good priming. And for that, we're going to be using this new to me, Mr. Hobby Aqueous Primer. And I have to say, I'm pretty much falling in love with this as a primer. Really, really enjoyed it. It says it can be thinned with water. I did choose to thin with Mr. Leveling Thinner, and it just sprays on beautifully. I have done the regular Mr. Surfacer in the past, but I find that I struggle with getting the proper thinning ratio with Mr. Surfacer. With this one, I have not had an issue whatsoever getting the proper thinning ratio with this. And I feel like it's pretty forgiving regardless of how you thin it. So very happy with this, very pleased with it. It sprays beautifully, goes on nicely, has a nice kind of I don't want to say like a satin finish, but almost a satin finish when it goes on, which is great with me. So the particular paint scheme I'm doing the box art paint scheme, and it has this, so the cowl is all black, and then it has this kind of lightning bolt motif running back behind it over the exhaust panels down to the back wing root. And the kit does provide decals for this, but I wanted to paint it. So here I actually took the decal off the decal sheet, taped it down to some tape, and I am going to cut out a template that I can then apply to the model and use that as a template for painting this particular marking. It's not terribly complicated. I mean, it's literally just this lightning bolt look, but I'll have to do 2 layers because I'll have to do the black and then the white part as well. So here I'm just cutting it out. I'm cutting this on a piece of like ceramic tile. I find the ceramic tile is an extremely useful surface for cutting on because the knife is not going to cut into the actual tile itself. So you can get good, nice cuts. I also use this for removing parts from like photo etch frets for the same purpose. It makes it really easy to cut things out. So here I'm going to apply the lightning stencil to the side of the aircraft here, and I'm trying to get it as close as possible to how it would, how the decal would sit on there. I did struggle a little bit with trying just to get like the front end matched up with the back end, but I think I got close enough. So we're gonna get that applied on there, make sure that's nice and down. There is a bit of a lot of surface roughness going on there, so just be aware of that. So here we got the rest of the cowl paint taped off, and then any possible area where paint could leak in, I put a little bit of the liquid masking on. So now we're going to go ahead and do the white part here. So this is just going to be that white stripe, so we're going to get that painted on, and nice good solid coat here. I opted on this build to not do any pre-shading. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to experiment with doing post-shading work that I haven't normally done before. Really just kind of try and exercise and how to do it, and how the type of effects that I can achieve with it, versus doing like a black basing pre-shading type of look. And I always struggle with doing pre-shading on camouflage surfaces anyways, so I feel like this would be a good alternative to doing pre-shading on future camouflage products. So here I'm applying a very narrow thin strip of tape over the white, so this will act as the masking for my white stripe here on the aircraft emblem. And so we're just going through getting the proper lengths cut and applied on there, applying it with some tweezers here just to help get that in the right spot. So when we get to this point here, because I need a nice fine point here, so I'm using a brand new blade, and I'm trying to use as little pressure as possible to get these parts cut, because I don't really want to cut into the plastic and mar up the surface there. So there we go, got that on there. And now we can move on to masking off the white band on the rear fuselage here. So again, I'm just using really thin tape to kind of set my line, my edge, and then I can fill it in with larger tape. I find that especially when you're going around compound curved surfaces like this fuselage, the narrower the strip of tape you use, the straighter the line you can get, and the less like buckling you would have of the tape. So I find this the most efficient way of doing it. And then I'll come in and fill the center part in with much wider tape and clean that up. There we go. So now we can move on to actually painting our camouflage part. I'm going to start off with the bottom using this pale blue color and just going for a good, nice, solid coverage. Not looking for any major modulation in the color, and just really wanted to get it on there and then worry about any kind of modulation in the weathering and, post effect kind of a thing. So we're going to get the entire bottom of the aircraft painted. We're also going to do the sides of the aircraft as well, as the bottom color kind of wrapped up around the side before being covered by camouflage on the upper surfaces. So just got to make sure I'm getting nice good coverage. I am using the Vallejo paint here, and I'm thinning it with Mr. Leveling Thinner. I wish I could tell you the ratio, but I don't necessarily keep track of ratios. It's more I thin it to feel how it sprays and feels and sounds in the airbrush, and that's how I get to the point where I'm happy with the color. But I would say it's more thinner than you would expect. So now we're going to do this gray violet color on the upper surfaces. So you can see that because of the black part that we masked off previously, it already creates a nice good solid demarcation between like the wing and the fuselage. So I don't have to worry about masking that there. Otherwise you would want a hard edge there. And again, going with just nice good solid coverage here. I am not necessarily covering every single part because I do know that there will be areas that will be painted the green color for the camouflage. So I am leaving some parts bare, but here you can see I'm going to start working on the upper side camouflage and getting this applied. I am freehanding the demarcation between like the upper camouflage and the side of the fuselage, just because that portion was fairly soft, and then it does get blended in with mottling later on. And it's interesting because looking at the the actual paint diagram, the color callout for this one, there was only that one little section on the back fuselage spine that had the gray violet color. And now we're doing green. And you see here I have done a hard camo edge here. As far as I could tell, they were pretty much close to like real hard edge on the camouflage for these things, and not like feathered, like it had just been sprayed on. So using the color guide in the instruction booklet as a guide, I cut out the patterns in blue tape to apply them on. And then here I'm going to freehand this portion of the camouflage and get that on there. So that's going to fill up the rest of the upper surface, and you can see I did mask off that small gray violet area just by the rear band, and now I can start doing some mottling. Another interesting thing with this particular paint scheme is you could see that they must have had some markings on the aircraft and then they were painted over and then new markings put it on, so that's where there's like that big green splotch on the side. And so the color instructions do call that out. That wasn't just me like goofing up or anything. So just beware. If you do this particular paint scheme, it would appear that at some point they had covered up some previous markings to then reapply new markings on top of that. So now we can remove all of our masking tape, reveal our nice clean edges there. So pretty happy with how that's looking. Tiny little area that needed to be touched up here, so it's a good thing I had the paint still in the airbrush. But now we can remove our masking for the white band on the rear fuselage. So this all comes off, looks pretty good. Pretty happy with it. The tweezers definitely help when removing this. You just have to be careful you don't scratch your paintwork, because that would be a pain. So the ID band came out nice. Another little bit of touch up there that I'm getting on there. And now we can start removing the masking for the cowl. And there's just something about the way that like the black cowl looks with the lightning bolt symbols on the side and then the rest of the camouflage that just really makes this a standout paint scheme for me. And yeah, this was fun. So we can see here all of our hard work with the masking has paid off, and in general I find that to be the case, that we really take the time, slow down, and do your masking right, it will pay off in the end. So moving on to the spinner. So the German aircraft had a unique way of painting their spinners. On American aircraft, the reason why, well, I should say one of the reasons why the propeller tips were painted yellow was because when the propellers were spinning, you'd be able to see that yellow band around the edge of the propeller, and it would let ground crew know that the propellers were spinning and, the extent of how far they reach. The Germans had a slightly different approach to this, and so they used some kind of pattern on the actual like nose cone itself, the spinner nose cone. Sometimes it was a swirl, like it's going to be in this case. Sometimes it would be, like a quarter of the nose cone would have been painted a different color, and it'd be obvious that the propeller was spinning. So just like the pattern on the side of the aircraft here, we used the decal to create a template that we could then apply to the spinner and mask off that swirl. So we're going to go ahead and get some black paint on here and give us a nice good swirl pattern on here. Fortunately, this doesn't have a very tight swirl. Some of the German aircraft had a really tight spiral around the nose cone, and that would have been kind of a pain to paint, but again, it would have worked. So here we can remove the masking tape, reveal our nice little spinner there. I did have to do a little bit of touch up. Some of the edges were a little rough, but in the end we got there. Painting the tires with some NATO black by Tamiya. I really love the NATO black color because it's not quite black. There's like little hints of brown in there, and it's more of like just like a really, really, really dark gray. And I find it works good for painting wheels and tires and things like that. So with all of our major paint work done, we can go ahead and move on to securing everything and getting it all covered in a nice gloss varnish. So this will help us in the next stages of our build and protect all of our paintwork up until this point. I am using the Alclad Aqua Gloss acrylic varnish, and I love this stuff. It's so easy to work with. It dries really fast, and it dries rock solid. So definitely would recommend it. Spraying it on fairly wet and ready for the next step. So one of the things that I wanted to use this kit to experiment with is trying to figure out the Eduard decals. And I've tried in the past and never had good results. But after doing some searching online and watching multiple videos, I've settled upon a process that works for me. So you can see here, I'm applying Solvaset directly to the model and then placing the decal on top. Normally I'd use the Solvaset on top of the decal, but I've found this way works. The one issue with doing this method is pretty much once you get the decal on there, it's not going to want to move because the Solvaset starts working pretty quickly. So you really have to be careful in your decal placement. And this might work with other decal setting solutions, but I haven't tested other ones. Solvaset's my pretty much my go-to for all of them. So anyways, so you place the Solvaset down first, you place your decal on top of it, then you kind of do your normal process for getting the decal nice and settled here. You can see I'm just using the cotton bud to, push it down, remove all the excess setting solution, and really kind of work it into the details. And you just keep going through, apply your decals like this. I feel like it does take a little bit more time just because you have to be really careful on the placement, like I said, but eventually you'll get there, you'll get all your decals on, and get them all in the right places here. There was a fair amount of decals going onto this kit, so it did take me a little while, and I really tried hard to get as many of the smaller decals, the stencils, things like that on there as well. I'm not going to show all that. I think you get the point of what I'm trying to show here. And then here's the critical part: is you have to leave the decals alone for 24 hours. Don't touch the model, just let it sit, let the Solvaset work its magic, and then after 24 hours you can come and peel the decal film off. And I think it's the waiting time that was getting me in trouble before, is because I wouldn't give it enough time to actually fully set. But now, having determined that 24 hours is the minimum time, now I had zero issues with any of the decals peeling off the film. And you could even use a little tiny piece of sticky tape and get it on the corner of the film, and that'll pull it up as well. I feel like I had just a little bit more control using the tweezers, and I'm really using very little pressure. I'm just kind of getting the edge of these pointy tweezers up against the edge of the decal film, which is fairly thick, for these decals, so it's not terribly difficult to do. So I'm using very little pressure, which means I'm not scratching the finish and the paintwork and stuff. But you can see here how it's all lifting off. And so here's a version with the carrier film, and then here's one without the carrier film. And I think there's a huge difference in the quality of how they look. So I feel like I've finally figured out the Eduard decals, and I'm liking them now. So now we're going to go on to weathering. So we're using our same watercolor wash here that we used on the Cockpit. And again, so this one I am applying over a gloss coat, which I didn't do in the Cockpit, but it's going to work I had to do the gloss coat for the decals, so it's fine. And now we're just going to apply it all over. And I'm putting this on pretty liberally. There are a lot of rivets on this kit, so it's just easier and faster to do it this way. Get it everywhere. I'm using the same mixture that I used before, so this is kind of a really, really dark blackish brown color, and I think it works pretty good. So we're just going to get this applied all over, everywhere we need to get it. And yes, you can see how it's kind of bubbling up. That is kind of a result of having the dish soap in there. If you are, scrubbing this on, as it were, it's going to create bubbles, but it's not going to cause any problems or issues when it comes time for the actual solution to set in. So we'll just go ahead and get it all over, and then once it's dry, we can come back and remove it with a damp cloth. And you can see how it's depositing pretty nicely into all the rivets and the detail and the panel lines, without necessarily being super strong and it's not a super high contrast thing, especially in the rivets, because it would look kind of weird if it was just really strong and out there. But here's one of the second things that I wanted to practice doing, was basically doing a post shading technique. Now, this used to be all the rage back in the 90s, the early 2000s, before black basing really kind of started catching on. And I think there are times when the application, if done well, looks good and can look good. I know that there's a lot of memes, scale modeling memes out there about doing this type of post shading effect. And I get it. it's not necessarily the most like realistic thing. So if you're really striving for a realism look, this is definitely not the effect to go for. But I think what it does, at least in my opinion, is it does a good job of conveying like just a sense of overall grime and use and wear without necessarily looking like it's just completely trashed. And so I think there's a good balance, and you can see here I'm using, I mean, this paint is thinned like 96% thinner and 3% or 4% paint, so it's really thin, and I'm just spraying it on in really thin layers to really just help provide a little like contrast in the panels and the details, just to help kind of break things up a little bit. There are a few areas that I decided to go a little bit heavier, like around the cockpit where there would be more wear from ground crew and the pilot and just people moving about there. So there are a few places where I did build it up a little bit stronger, and mainly it's just in areas that I thought made sense. So around like access hatches, around the engine, on the underside of the aircraft, I built it up a little bit more along the center line where there would be more fuel and oil leakage and exhaust, things like that. So in my mind, it makes sense, but the effect is really subtle, but I feel like it does just add a little extra layer and depth to the overall model. So at this point, we can seal in all of our decals and our shading work with a matte coat, and this will allow us to move on to the next stage of weathering, which is going to be oils. So for this, I'm using the Vallejo matte coat. I thin this with X20A thinner, and I'm probably doing like 30% thinner, 70% matte coat. And that seems to be a good ratio to get, for one, to spray well, but also to get like, to really cut down the shine, but not like ultra flat. I don't like ultra flat look. That doesn't seem realistic to me. I like to have like a little bit of a shine, because even if you look at like pictures of period aircraft, like they still have a bit of a shine to them. And I think that's just the result of, being painted metal. So that's kind of the look that I like to go for. So at this point, we can start removing our masking, because we're not going to be doing any more overall layers of like spraying. And so you can see here the Eduard masks did a great job, and definitely did what they were supposed to do. So now we're going to do a little bit of paint chipping, and for this I am using oily steel. This is the same paint we used on the interior of the cockpit. And we're using the same method, just using a small brush, just applying it in a little, kind of like a little dabbing motion. And again, I'm trying to keep it along areas where I think it would make sense, where people would be moving about, would be interacting with the aircraft. Like, it wouldn't make sense to have huge chip marks on like the rudder, for example, because the rudder would have been cloth covered. So definitely need to be conscious of where you're putting chipping and where it makes sense, along access hatches, along places where like mechanics tools might bang up against the edge of a panel, or, things like that, where their boots would be scraping along. That all makes sense. So for example, you have these little hash marks along the wing, like that was to indicate to the ground crew where they could step on the wing. So it would make sense to have chipping inside that area, because they would be moving about there, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have a lot of chipping outside that area, because what would be causing those chips? So here I'm just doing a little bit of a metallic edge on the propeller blades, and I have tended to overdo this in the past, and so I'm trying to be a little bit more subtle in that type of chipping. And so that's why I'm just doing like a very fine edge. Here we're going to do a little bit of oil work on the aircraft. I'm not going to go too much with this. Again, I wasn't trying to like go for a super worn, dirty aircraft, but definitely enough to give like hints of, as the ground crew is working on the aircraft, they might like track little spots of mud on from their boots or whatever. So just kind of show a little bit of wear and build up there. So I'm just trying to concentrate it around like the wing root area and around the gun hatches, things like that, where they would be actively like opening and closing it after every mission, or accessing the machine guns on where the machine guns would be on the upper portion of the fuselage, things like that. And I've used this technique multiple times before. So basically I just wet the area with thinner, apply oil paint directly onto the surface of the model, and then use a soft brush to help blend it all in. And sometimes you have to build it up in layers. So here you can see I'll apply a little bit of oil paint, blend it in, apply a little bit more, blend it in, things like that. So with the oil work done, we can work on our exhaust. So obviously black paint wouldn't show up very well on black paint for the exhaust. So I'm using this gray just to really kind of show the exhaust effect on against the black, and build that up. And I'm really trying to keep it thin. I don't want it to be super gray, but I just want the hint of that exhaust look. And the reason why I have parts taped off there is just because I didn't want exhaust getting out where it physically wouldn't be able to get. So now we're going to do a little bit of exhaust work on the underside. This I will use black just because I will be doing it over the gray surface, and I think it helps sell the effect here. So we're going to work it around the bomb rack there, the drop tank rack, along the sides of that. And then you also have to make sure that if you have any, like the landing gear covers for the wheels, if they close and there would be exhaust coming over it, you have to make sure you do get a little bit of exhaust on those as well, so that they match up. As well as I did some of the shell ejection ports for the cannons. Maybe a little overdone, but I kind of like the detail. So at this point, we can just start working on some of the smaller details of the build to wrap it all up. So here we're adding this liquid chrome to the oleo strut for the landing gear. And this stuff is great, but it's kind of a pain to work with because it comes in like this pen form, so you have to get it out of the pen and onto the brush because the pen applicator doesn't really work good. At least I haven't been able to get it to work good on plastic. I mean, it works fine if you're writing on paper or something, but so you kind of have to extract the liquid chrome and then apply it with a brush, and you really have to be careful because you don't want to keep going over and over the same spot. It will dull down the shine of it. But I think this is a good a good look for what we're trying to go for. Here I'm using some the clear UV resin to attach these glass panels to the outside of the canopy. And the reason why I'm using the UV curing resin is because I didn't want to use super glue, because I didn't want to risk any chance of the clear parts fogging. And I didn't want to use liquid cement because I didn't want it to wick into the center of the panel and again cause problems with the glass and damage it. And the UV clearing resin really does a good job of securing parts like this, and you'll never see it. So it works really good. You just use a little light to cure it, and then at this point we can start getting all of our landing gear attached. And this is probably the one area of the kit that actually didn't have like super solid fit. There was a little give in how the landing gear fits in there, so just be aware that this area will need a little bit more attention. We can get the propeller on and the spinner on, and this is a point in the build where it really makes me happy because it's like it's finally coming together as a complete airplane. And again, in addition to the landing gear, the wheels fitting onto landing gear don't have a super positive fit as well. So you really have to be careful to make sure that you're getting them aligned correctly, and then let it dry before you put any pressure on the wheels. Otherwise they'll get all askew and out of alignment, and then it kind of ruins the look, because they have the 190 had very particularly looking landing gear. So we can get the doors on. These just basically slot into place and then attach to the wheel well or the landing gear strut itself. And then we're going to add just a little bit of dirt and dust buildup along the bottom here, just to help it blend in with the rest of the aircraft and all the work we've done previously. Normally I would try and do this off the model, but I think I just ended up forgetting, to be honest with you. So here I've mixed up a little bit of white and brown oil paints to fit into the recesses here. This will just kind of help sell the effect of like dirt and dust built up on the tire, and really wanting it to sink into the treads and highlight the tread pattern on there. And then what I'll do is I'll come back through, and once it's dry, is wipe it off with a little bit of thinner and leave the dust effect in the treads, but remove it from the actual surface of the wheel. I think it'll look pretty good without being super strong. So here we're just coming with the thinner, cleaning up the tires and getting rid of all that excess wash on there. I think it's a good look. It's pretty simple, and I didn't want to like show like built up mud on there, so I think this works good. So here we can get the canopy installed, and I really like the look of the F190 canopy. I think it looks good. And we're going to bring back our UV clearing resin here to cover the navigation lights. Simple effect, but it looks good. And now we can do our radio antenna. So we're starting here with this tiny little bump on the canopy, and I drilled a small hole in there to accept the easy line with just a tiny dot of super glue. This is one of those things where you really have to exercise your patience and not overdo it, because you can easily ruin the look. Now we're going to apply a little bit of super glue to this post here on the tail, and slightly stretch the string a little bit so that it's taut. And typically it doesn't take long for that super glue to set onto the string, so you just kind of hold it there for a minute and then you can get it on there. And now we're going to do this little part of the aerial. So we just drilled a tiny little hole in the top of the fuselage spine there, insert our thread with the glue, and then finally we're going to add a little bit of glue to the line here and attach it. This is one of those things, I mean, you could do, the whole process takes 10-15 minutes to do. You just have to take your time and make sure you're being patient with it. And then we just clip off the excess with our clippers. This works better with like sharp clippers, but there you go. So now we can just kind of paint over some of our glue spots there to help blend them in, and then paint the insulators at each end. And I think we have a pretty decent looking radio wire there. I'm happy with it, at least. Finally, we can attach the smallest pieces here. So here we're going to add the pitot tube. This has been pre-painted ahead of time, so get that on there. The little boarding ladder, get that attached. This little antenna here, this will need to be painted. I opted it was just going to be easier to paint this one on the model. I'll just brush paint that and weather that up to match. And then I'm not sure what this piece does, to be honest with you, but it's kind of a neat piece. So we get that added on. Again, that'll have to be painted as well. And then there's finally this tiny little photo etch antenna that goes on as well. And these little indicators will pop up on the wings so that the pilot has a visual indication that the landing gear is down and locked. And with that, we're going to wrap up the airplane and move on to the diorama base. So I wanted to build something simple to display the airplane, but I also wanted to add some figures. And so I found this Tamiya kit that comes with a little staff car and a couple of figures. But what was really interesting was that the pilot figure is in the process of like attaching his parachute harness, and there's another soldier or airman or whatever they would call him that's like helping him. And I just thought that was like a really cool visual to show that, like, hey, he's just about getting ready to go up, so the guy's helping him into his parachute harness and he's going to take off, and then, maybe the staff car would be there to have dropped him off at his plane or something. So that's kind of the look that I was going for here. And the Tamiya figures go together really well. The molding is really sharp and crisp. The mold lines weren't too difficult to, clean up and scrape away. So all in all, these are really great figures for plastic figures. And the figures themselves have a lot of expression to them, and it's obvious what they're doing. So I think it'll work out good. So we just got to get these figures put together here, and which isn't too difficult. The parts all just fit well together, and there is a little bit of like play in how the poses work exactly, but it's not too bad. Then we're going to move on to the staff car, start working on this thing as well. It's pretty simple. It pretty much comes on like one sprue, plus the main body was separate, and then a small clear sprue. So there's not a lot of parts to it. You have a really simple interior, and a little bit from like the undercarriage and things like that. I decided I did need to drill up the exhaust, because why not? And so just drilling that out there. Pretty straightforward. Get that installed on the lower chassis. It just slots in, and we can move forward from there. It's interesting because the back axle, the way that it slides in, it can be left free to spin, but the front axle can't. So I find that interesting. I mean, obviously they weren't intending it for it to roll around, but just interesting note. Here we can see the instrument panel and the steering wheel column getting installed. There was a little plane here, so I just kind of took a little bit of finagling to get that together, but overall not terrible. We can get the steering wheel put on. This is a very small, delicate part, and it's the sprue attachment points are obviously around the perimeter of the steering wheel, so you have to be careful clipping it from the sprue so that it doesn't break, and especially when you're cleaning it up, you don't want to ruin it. Priming the inside with some black here, and in preparation to paint the interior. Same thing with the underside and the inside of the chassis. Again, there's not a ton of detail here, and I didn't bother like detailing and painting the underside. Just you're never going to see it because it's going to be sitting on grass. I also took this time to prime the figures. You can see I have them on these little wargaming miniature bases. They're just super glued on with a tiny amount of super glue, and then the bases actually have a magnet in it, which it lets it slot into these little blue handles, and these are quite handy to have for figure painting. They just make it easy to hold, paint, and then obviously when you're not painting it, you can plop it back down on that little stand, and yeah, quite nice. I'll put a link down into the description on where you can pick those up. I also decided to do an officer here, just to have a little more visual interest. Painting the inside kind of like a leather tan color. I kind of figured that's what it would look like. I really didn't do a ton of research on what German staff cars looked like. I'm just kind of doing what I think looks good. So if it's completely wrong, let me know, but I think I got pretty close. And, I mean, obviously also following the instructions as well. So get the leather color painted in there, nice and solid, and then we're gonna put a little bit of our watercolor wash on there. Ultimately, this didn't work. The wash didn't really work out how I wanted it to. It ended up just kind of making it look like dirty leather. So hindsight, wouldn't have done that, but it is what it is. Again, you're not going to be able to see much into the staff car once it's done. The windows are pretty small. So I gave a base coat onto the soldiers. I've struggled in the past with properly showing figure painting, and I think I did a better job on this one, so let me know in the comments down below what you think. But I base coated all the figures, and right now I'm just giving a dry brush. This is kind of like my initial pass. This really helps me to, see the detail, define the detail, and it just helps me to visualize what I need to start painting next. The pilot was base coated a different color than the other soldiers, but again, I'm just using pretty much like a buff color dry brush just to really pick out all of those details, and this will hit like all of like the ridges on his clothes, at his uniform, and things like that to really help me and because the figures are so small, really help me see what I'm doing there. We can get the decal applied for the instrument panel, start getting the car put together, and the fit of the car was fantastic, by the way. I mean, what else would you expect? But really, really nice. So here we're going to go ahead and paint up the car using this German gray color. And I did have to do a little bit of sanding to remove some mold lines from the roof of the car, but nothing too bad. It really didn't take very long. And yeah, get that all nice and coated on there. Don't forget the fenders as well. Wasn't worried about like overspray onto the instrument panel, so didn't bother masking that off. But get the fenders on there, get the inside of the fenders as well, just because you could potentially see up into there. Here I'm just hand painting the tires. I didn't want to bother with trying to cut out circle masks that would fit this. The rim between the tire and the lip between the tire and the rim is pretty large, so painting it was pretty easy. Moving back to the figures, we're going to start working on the skin, and it's interesting because I spent a number of years as a commission painter doing wargaming painting, and skin was always just one of those things that I really, really struggled with. And I've tried looking at, watching videos and stuff, and just for whatever reason, it's just a concept that I struggle to grasp. So I think I did okay with these ones in the end. So right now I'm just giving like a base coat of like a really light flesh color, and then I'll come in with a wash and some highlights to help create definition on. Again, the sculpt of the figures really helps because the definition of the details on the skin is really nice and crisp, so it's really easy to see what I'm painting and what the details are. Sometimes you'll get figures that have like really soft like mushy features, and that makes it a little bit harder to paint. So here I'm adding in a wash just to help create like artificial shadow and depth to the skin, and also to kind of create a little bit more richer skin tone other than just like super pale. And go ahead and get this applied all over all the skin parts. I generally try to avoid using too many washes in my figure painting now, just because I feel like it can be kind of a crutch, and I still have to use it though with skin tones. I've gotten better with everything else. So here we're going to paint up the boots, and pretty simple, just using like a semi-gloss black here, painting details on the belt and his holster, on the officer's belt and everything. The backpack, or not the backpack, sorry, the parachute pack and his like harness and webbing all gets painted here. I had to look at a couple pictures of German parachutes to really get an idea of how this was going together. So I hope I got pretty close. I know it's not going to be perfect. Again, I don't have a lot of experience painting like German Luftwaffe figures, so this was a fun little side research project to figure out how this all goes together. But so we're just starting with this kind of like earth tone brown color as our base coat, and we'll dry brush and highlight up from there. So once the wash on the skin dries, I'm going to come back in with our pale skin tone to kind of highlight the features on the figure. And so this will kind of give us like 3 ranges. You'll have like a highlight, you'll have like the base flesh tone, and then like the darker recesses. And generally that can be pretty good for simple figure painting. I mean, I wish I had the skills to really push this further, and like, I mean, you have those guys that can do like 5 o'clock shadow on a figure like this, and maybe one day I'll get there. Definitely need to practice more. So, but we just go through and do that with all the figures. Here I'm going to add dry brush to the pilot's parachute pack. And this will just kind of help define some of those details that are on there, because the sculpting on the parachute on this figure in particular was extremely nice and crisp, and just looked really great. So now we're going to highlight the actual strap parts here. So they're just using like a light tan color, and I am using a rather narrow brush to get this done. When I was doing figure painting, commissioned figure painting for wargaming, one of the art directors that I worked with, his philosophy was like, use the biggest brush you can get away with, because it can hold the most amount of paint, and you spend less time like going back and forth between your palette. But obviously, as an artist doing commission work like that, time was our most valuable asset. We were paid, the faster we could get it done, the more value we got out of the commission. And so that was all about like, if you can save a few seconds here and there, like that'll save you in the long run on a project. But I find when I'm doing like one-off figures, or 3 figures like this, use a small brush. It just makes it a little bit easier to get you the details just right. So here we're going to pick out some of the metallic details, like the buckles and the snaps and things like that. So here we go. I mean, that's pretty much the figures in a nutshell. There's a few steps that I didn't show just because I failed to film it properly, but I think you get the idea of what I was trying to go for there. The license plate on the vehicle, I didn't realize the whole thing needed to be painted white. I thought it was going to be a white decal going on it, so I had to mask that off and paint that. The front license plate though did have a full white decal, so interesting that they chose to do it that way, but that's how it is. No big deal. Get the few decals on just to identify the vehicle, and then we can kind of start assembling the rest of the vehicle here. So that there's 2 clear parts. You get like the main body clear part and then the windshield. They go on separately, but the fit here is just excellent. They go on so well, and almost like snap fit. We can get the front fender installed, and finally the chassis. Like I said, this all just snaps into place. Very, very nice. And get the front grille on. It's kind of a shame that this is all painted in military colors. It'd be kind of fun to get another one of these and paint it up as an actual civilian vehicle, because I think it would look pretty good. Front bumper going on with the license plate. And now we're just going to add a little bit of like earth tone, just to kind of show like a little bit of dust is accumulated on the vehicle. Again, I didn't want the vehicle to be kind of like a focal point on the diorama. I wanted it just to be a part of the diorama, so I wasn't going to go crazy on like weathering and shading and all that stuff. I really just wanted to get it on there to make it look like it was part of the scene, but not overwhelm the scene. There are a few details that you do have to pick out by hand. I mean, I suppose you could try and mask this off and spray paint it, but I feel like the amount of time that would be needed to properly mask off the wipers and the rubber gasket that would go around the window is just too much work when you can just hand paint it. So now we can work on assembling, getting the wheels on there. These just snap into place. I also added a little bit of like that earth airbrush to the wheels as well, just to make them blend in. And there we go. So now we can move on to the base. So I'm just using a 12-inch round piece of wood I got from the craft store. And the reason why I put that little piece of tape there on the bottom of the base is because I wanted to have a plaque on here, and I wanted it to be unobstructed from whatever I was going to be putting on the base. So I put the piece of tape down there to protect that portion of the wood, where I can later put the plaque. So now I can do Mod Podge all over, and then I'm going to use this ground effect stuff. So this is actually like ground up foam, so it's really, really lightweight. I'd never used this before. I wanted to try it out, I'd only used this once before, so I wanted to try it out again, see if it was something that I liked. And at this point now I'm going to add grass to it. And so I have the airplane on there because I needed it on there to determine how much grass I wanted to put on and where I wanted to put the grass on. And so now I'm just applying the Mod Podge directly over the ground effect that we'd used earlier. I'm not being super careful on this, obviously, just trying to get it on there and kind of make it look patchy and not super nice. And now I'm going to be using the Citadel grass. The color is irrelevant because I'm going to paint over all of this stuff, so I just use this tan color because I don't use it very often, mainly just because it is a solid color, and like grass is not ever a solid color. So it's good for doing things like paint when you're going to paint over the grass work. So we can knock off our excess, we can save that, recover that, and save that. So at this point I'm going to remove the tape here so that I can prime the entire base, including that spot. So here we are, all primed. Now I've remasked over that empty spot, and now I'm going to start painting all of our groundwork. So we're going to use a couple different shades of brown here for our earth, and then we'll do the grass as well. So we're just kind of going through, and I'm not trying to be get super solid coat here. I really want it to be patchy. I want some of that darker stuff to show through, and that'll help create some nice variation in our groundwork. So I'm just going to work with a couple of progressively lighter shades of brown to kind of build that up and give us our dirt effect there. So just going around, getting that all complete. Again, just kind of like trying to be random with the squiggles and patterns and stuff like that. So now we can start working on the grass, and the grass is going to be the same way as the earth. We're just going to start with like a dark color and progressively work up to some lighter colors and creating variation, but allowing some of that dark undertone to show through. I think it just helps create a little bit more contrast in to help separate between like the grass and the dirt, and just overall I feel like it does a pretty good job of creating some interesting variation there. So now we're going to do some lighter colors here. I'm kind of using like an olive drab type color, and this will help just give us a little bit more yellow into our grass and create a little bit more of a warmer tone. And eventually I do add like little spots of yellow as well. So at this point we can remove our tape. So this will reveal like the nice primed section of the base here. And so at this point all the basic work is done. We can now assemble the diorama. And again, I was really going simple with this. I really wanted the focus to be the airplane, but also to have some context for the airplane. So now we can start adding in our figures. So these are just being glued on with super glue. Nothing fancy here. And here's our pilot, getting his parachute harness attached. We're going to get him situated in front of the aircraft, and then get his little helper there. So get that guy going in there. I did play around with the composition ahead of time, so this is pretty much how I wanted it to go. So here is the plaque. I just got this off of eBay, or not, sorry, not eBay, off of Amazon. It was like $8 or something, so pretty cheap, and it arrived in about a week and a half, so quite happy with it, and glad it fits into the spot that we saved for it. So we'll just go ahead and get this super glued on and call it good. So this is going to wrap up the build, and I think overall this build is probably my most technically well done build. And I say that in terms of just, I feel like I was really on top of my game with the paint work and the weathering and just everything going together. The kit was just a brilliant kit to build. I had zero issues with it other than just like the slight fitting things with the landing gear. Other than that, like, it just fell together. This was an enjoyable build. I had a lot of fun building this, and this kit in particular is like really what makes me enjoy building models. It was just genuinely a lot of fun. And then throwing it all together on the base with the figures and the car, like, everything fell together and it worked. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I was able to nail down the Eduard decals and finally figure those out, because now I'm really starting to like them. I mean, I definitely would prefer like some cartograph decals, but I can live with them now, and it makes me excited to build more new Eduard kits. So yeah, this was fun. If you've made it this far into the video, I know it's long. Leave some comments down below. Let me know what you think of this long format video and seeing everything. Let me know what you think about the techniques that I've used in this, if there are techniques you use. I do need to give a shout out to my patrons, and I appreciate their support of this channel. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment below. I like to talk with you and interact with you. I answer every single comment. So again, thank you everyone, and we'll see you on the next video.